We all have our favorite boys, and we all have our reasons for supporting said boys. But there's gotta be a best boy, right? I'm not an impartial arbiter for this fate, but I like making lists and yapping about twists. So today we're going to be discussing our lovely juniors and deciding which of them is the best of the best at NRC. We'll be looking at their overall personality, studiousness, and dorm card utility as determining factors, with each of these receiving a score from 1 to 10. With a possible 30 points on the board, we're going to be battling it out for Best Boy. However, we do have a few contenders that were also featured in the Best Housewardens video, which also talked about 2 of our criteria. To make sure this video isn't complete deja vu, I've updated the personality sections and refreshed the card utility bits for each of these individuals. Also, as per usual, there will be spoilers for EN server story content, including vignettes and events, so this is your spoiler warning. With all of that said, let's begin in Heartslable with our tooth-obsessed big brother, Trey Clover. Trey, the most average of Joes, with the wackiest hat this side of the Mississippi. Trey keeps a low profile on purpose, but unlike some other folks, it has nothing to do with subterfuge or shady business dealings. Instead, Trey tries to blend in with the crowd because he's uncomfortable with receiving attention, and that informs a lot of his decisions and actions. One of his vignettes is even titled "Normal is What I Am," while another is titled "Nailing That Bare Minimum." So I think summing up Trey as a normal guy is a pretty normal thing to do. In fact, he's so average in every aspect, it's almost shocking that he has special talents and interests in baking and dental care respectively. But honestly, it'd be super boring if he didn't have any quirks, and these two create some fantastic moments. Trey is the son of bakers, and in that position, you're bound to learn a thing or two, and boy, howdy, did Trey learn. It doesn't really matter what kind of sweet it is, Trey can make it and do so phenomenally. Even his Soom is adept in the kitchen when it comes to these pursuits, so you know it's gotta be near and dear to his heart. You know what else is? Dental care. This guy will not let you escape if you don't brush your teeth, and no excuse you can give will be good enough. Because he's got the largest stockpile of tooth cleaning implements and accoutrements on campus, or at least that's my assumption, based on the fact that he immediately offered spare toothbrushes to Ace and Deuce in his school uniform vignette. Also, given that his Soom literally jumped some of the Heartslable students who were going to skimp out on toothbrushing after eating their tart, and regular Trey just let it happen, I think shows just how serious Trey is about this. Which brings up a really good point, I think, about his character. While Trey doesn't like to be praised, he's not going to belittle his talents in order to ensure that he conforms. Instead, he's going to adapt things he isn't passionate about to suit this goal, while still retaining his talents. Plus, given how much he cares about everyone's teeth, you know that he probably also truly cares about their well-being. Couple this with his soft approach to handling riddle and gentle overall nature, it's no wonder that folks compare him to an older brother. Though I think it's important to note that even though Trey is gentle, he's not a pushover, and we can see this demonstrated in his dorm uniform vignette. He lets the freshmen fail to create a cake after they've made their ridiculous demands of him, and once they have learned their lesson, they still have to deal with the consequences, because Trey's not going to bail them out completely. Sure, he made a new cake to save the party, but the freshmen can't partake in it until their mess of a cake has been eaten. A nice firm boundary that can come across as a dastardly action because Trey, of course, knew from the start that this endeavor would fail. But honestly, some people only learn if they make the mistakes themselves, so I don't really fault him too much here. Anyways, with all that said, I'm going to give him a 7 since it's a bit above average, but not exactly a stellar grade, which I think he would appreciate. Now, when it comes to studies, I think Trey aims to be just average so as to not draw attention to himself. However, I do think there are certain subjects where he excels despite his effort not to. Even if that is not the case for some reason, at the very least, there is absolutely no way that he's going to be allowed to retain his position as Vice Housewarden of Hartslable with bad grades. I just can't envision Riddle favoring nepotism over academics, especially now as a sophomore since his rule as housewarden is more cemented. So, because Trey is still his vice housewarden, I just can't imagine Trey doing poorly academically. Plus, Trey is also a part of the science club, and science, I think, is generally regarded as a harder subject. So if he's able to excel in that club and create fantastic strawberries as a result of his experimenting, he's likely smart enough to do well academically in other subjects too. So I'm going to give him another 7 here, which is another ranking I'm sure he would appreciate. From a card perspective, Trey's pretty chill. He's got a water, flora, and eventual cosmic defense type card with some nice utility and decent stats. At max level, the first spell provides modest HP restoration, and the third nullifies curse to allies while also boosting the caster. Overall, this is a decent defense type card that has the flexibility with its third spell to go to more situations since it's not too elementally locked. The HP restoration can be really nice, and if the third spell is unlocked, pairing this card with other healers can ensure that you're able to heal since you can nullify curses placed on those other healing cards. I've used Trey's dorm uniform for healing many times, and it's pretty reliable. The chunky HP stat also allows this card to balance out a team of attackers by bolstering the overall HP pool, and at the end of the day, it's honestly quite a solid pick, particularly for Hartslable enjoyers, so I'm going to give it another 7. So, Trey ends up with the nice tidy sum of 21 points. Moving on, we now have Cater. So Cater Diamond is a sunshiny, aspiring social media influencer who's very fun overall. He's got a bright demeanor, generically positive attitude in most situations, and is our OG in-universe shipper, so he definitely gets points for that. But don't let this happy-go-lucky mask deceive you, because underneath it, Cater has some complicated feelings that he doesn't like to show to anyone. This, I think, serves him well from a character standpoint because it gives him a bit of nuance, which in turn gives him depth, particularly by comparison. Khalid may be oblivious sunshine, but Cater is sunshine with an edge, and this distinction between Cater and some of the other positive characters truly helps him stand out. We get a few examples of this melancholy being teased out of him, like in his ceremonial robes vignette, where this forlorn gaze speaks volumes without having to be explicitly talked about, and in his labware vignette, where we have some of his mandrakes reflecting his more depressed side. Cater is very good at hiding these feelings from others, or at least he thinks he is, because we can see Trey struggling a little bit at times with Cater's lack of trust in him to talk about these things despite their friendship. But I think on the whole, if you don't really know him, you probably wouldn't pick up on these feelings either. But none of this is to say that Cater is miserable, though. In fact, he seems to be far from it, and he doesn't really let the whispers and gossip about him get him down, like we can see in his dorm uniform vignette, where he also single-handedly saved a good chunk of Hartslable from a beheading because of his magic hand snapping. He can be cheery, bright, socially adept, and a bit of a smooth talker when he wants to be. All qualities that any extrovert worth their salt would have, or so I'm told. Cater can also be insightful and offer advice or solutions to problems that the brain cell boys are facing, and he's also pretty smart overall, seeing how he tricked us into painting roses during book 1 like he was Tom Sawyer or something. In a lot of other situations too, Cater's social butterfly tendencies and overall awareness of trends come in very handy. During the Terror is Trending Halloween event, he gives us some thoughtful insight on the Magic Hand monsters storming the school. In his Playful Land vignette, he's able to convince Jack to search for hidden foxes with him, and he even gets Jack excited about the activity during their interactions. And the guy is one of the very few people on campus who's not afraid to straight up approach Malleus, although his intentions are a little less than pure, but still. Gator has a lot of positive things going for him, and overall, he's a very fun guy, so I'm going to give him an 8 here. On the studies front, though, Gator is not doing so hot. We get several examples of him slacking off in various ways. However, I do suppose I have to give him credit for reaching his junior year, because that means he's not failed out of school the previous 2 years, so his grades can't be that bad, right? But in his PE uniform vignette, we can see him skirting the rules and using his special magic to avoid actually running and completing the activity, which is totally a mood, but also not technically allowed and also technically slacking off. In Riddle's dorm uniform vignette, we can see Gator's addiction to Magicam interfering with his studies and his overall lack of care for this particular exam. Gator certainly isn't a sit down and memorize a book kind of guy, and that's entirely valid when it comes to academics because I, too, am not that kind of person. However, there seems to be a bit of helplessness when it comes to Gator that impacts his grade. I don't think it's necessarily a refusal to study, but it might be more akin to what Deuce describes in Book 5 when he's talking to Apple, where it's frustrating to the point where one might not try to fix it rather than finding an alternative because of the situation and system that they're in. We can see that Gator can do well in studying when the format makes sense to him, because Riddle is able to successfully relay the information for that particular test through Magicam, and it clicks with Gator during Riddle's dorm uniform vignette. But I'm not sure that Gator is continuing to make use of similar methods for his other classes and overall studies. It's a bit unfortunate, but as it stands, I've got to give him a 5 here because he has done well enough to survive for this long, but we don't get a lot of evidence in his favor when grades are concerned, so middle of the road it is. Now, Gator's card is a bit better, as it is a Flora, Fire, and eventual Cosmic Balance type card. The stats, therefore, are more balanced than the other card types, and the spells offer a bit more utility too. At max rank, the Flora spell will do strong damage and majorly cut foes' power that turn, while the unlockable Cosmic spell boosts the power of the caster and cuts foes' power during that turn. Because the elemental types of this card are almost rounded out, similar to Trey's, this card can also go in a variety of use cases, which makes it a bit more versatile than some of the other cards. Plus, if used alongside Trey's dorm uniform, you can cover the elemental gambit for an omni battle while also having access to both duos. I personally think this is a fun card, and in general I prefer using balanced cards since they usually have a bit more utility without fully compromising the stats. And this card is really no different. In the right circumstances, I think it can be very useful, and if you're building your teams around Hearts level characters, it's a solid pickup. Therefore, I'm going to rate it a 7 here. This means that Gator is receiving a total of 20 points. Alrighty, up next is Leona Kingscholar, the oldest kiddo of the human grouping and the king of Savannah Claw. This guy is one lazy lion who's gotta either really see the value in what he's doing, or it's going to be like pulling teeth to get him to do it. The reason for his laziness is likely tied to his past and his self-worth, as he was constantly put down despite doing well simply because he was second born, which I can absolutely see evolving into him not trying ever because it'll never be good enough to impress those who he desires validation from, or at least that has become his perception. Because of this, Leona is often found sleeping the day away in a variety of places, which also means he's skipping classes a ton. This has in part led to him being held back a few grades, which is why he's 20 while everyone else is a bit younger, but that does not by any means indicate his intelligence. In fact, Leona is wicked smart, plays chess regularly, and is able to come up with schemes on the fly. Since he has nothing to prove to anyone either, Leona's not necessarily worried about getting his hands dirty if he needs to, and he's willing to bend the rules to suit him or his goals if he can. Consistently skirting around these rules requires tact and skill, which Leona has in spades. The other thing he's got going for him is his charismatic leadership abilities, which we can see on display during Book 2, Book 3, and various vignettes like his dorm uniform. He's not going to waste his time going after small fries, but he's also not going to let problems get out of hand to the point where they disturb him. And if you're able to earn his respect, you'll be respected too. But if you're making a fool of yourself and aren't as talented at all, he's not going to give you the time of day. This goes for everyone, regardless of status, with the only true exceptions being his brother Felina and Malleus. However, overall, I think this is a very positive quality for him to have. And if you happen to trigger his competitive side, the lazy lion will disappear and you'll be met with the fiercest of opponents. The more of Leona we've gotten to see, the more he's kind of grown on me as a character, and while I feel he is a bit immature in his avoidance, he's got enough nuance to him to make him solid, and I have a lot of hope for his future. He's starting to grow a little bit here and there, and I think if he gave himself more love and more space to grow, he'd become a truly influential individual. But as it stands, he's not quite there, so he's not going to get a perfect score. Instead, he's going to receive an 8. When it comes to book smarts, Leona has them in spades. However, he doesn't apply himself to any of these academic pursuits, or at least that was the case in years past, because for all intents and purposes, Leona should have graduated long ago. He's been held back a few times, and while it was through his fault and his fault alone, that doesn't make him dumb, he's just lazy, like we talked about before. At the beginning of Book 7, we find out that Leona even qualifies for some of the most restrictive internships due to his grades being so good, which is wild considering how much he skips class, but regardless, he's doing fantastically academically. He's able to whip up a potion in a few minutes that took Ethel, Rook, and Grimm hours to make. He's got super strong unique magic, he tutors Ruggy and is somewhat responsible for Ruggy's grades improving, and he's just smart in general with his chess and his scheming. Technically speaking, Leona should rank high in this category because he is so wickedly smart, and he does get good grades. But he also skips class all the time and got held back a bunch, which doesn't really make him a good student. I'm rather conflicted here, but I think because Leona's so reluctant to apply himself and put in the effort, regardless of the reason or the end result of his grades, I'm going to give him a 5.5 here. Just because he can doesn't mean that he does, and I don't think ranking him particularly high here would be fair considering folks like Riddle and Azul who are not only smart, but also are applying themselves to all that they do with such vigor. So for Leona, it's a 5.5. From a card perspective, Leona's got a Flora, and eventual Flora attack type card that's really, really good in its specific use case. But that use case is niche, so this card's use is also limited. The card has no utility on the first 2 spells. They just kind of hit things hard. Only on the 3rd spell does this card have an additional effect of power drain on foes. So until you unlock that ability, you're limited to only dishing out damage, which isn't necessarily a problem given the intended use of this card, but it is still a bit disappointing considering a lot of the other dorm cards can also hit fairly well while providing additional effects. This was my very first SSR, so it does have a special place in my heart, but it's not the best overall card given how limited its use cases and abilities are. But again, when you use it in its intended context for its intended purpose, you'll be smoking the competition. So I'm still going to give this card a 5, which is a little mid because of the overall utility. That means that Leona is going to receive 18.5 total points. Wow. Next up is Vil Schoenheit. Now, Vil is a character that I initially dreaded meeting because celebrities can sometimes be a bit much with their entitlement and self-absorption. And because Vil is based off of the evil queen whose entire shtick is vanity, I was bracing myself for an incredibly vain and entitled character. But I'm sure you can imagine my relief when I found out that Vil is nothing like that. In fact, he's one of the most reasonable and probably mature characters in the main cast. Outside of his one little obsession, Vil has his head on straight and he pursues his goals with a relentless determination that is very admirable. His desire to be the best in the world is less about the shallow satisfaction of clout and more about personal growth and accomplishment. Vil wants to be the best because he wants to be the best. The praise is all well and good and he absolutely loves his efforts being recognized, but he's not chasing that applause solely for the endorphins. I think some of this perspective was shaped by his childhood, and honestly props to his dad, who we've not yet met as of this recording. But he must have done so well to not spoil Vil, despite all of his and Vil's successes, and I think that worked out, in the long run, so well for not only him but for Vil. However, I do think with all of the modeling and the movies and other jobs Vil has taken on from a very young age, he's probably grown up a little faster than his peers, which may be why he feels a bit more mature overall, even though he is still very much an adolescent that also makes terrible decisions, as adolescents tend to do. On the whole, though, Vil doesn't really seem to be concerned about the little scuffles, and he's not going to get hung up on things that aren't worth his time. He's worked way too hard to get where he is for someone else's temper tantrum to ruin it, but he's also not completely unreasonable and does recognize others' talents, no matter who they are. One very good example of this is Ortho. Ortho is an android in an extremely unique position, and apparently a lot of other folks at the school took him for granted as just an android prior to Book 6. Vil may have been among them at the time, however, after Book 6, Vil recognizes Ortho's talents for acting like he would for any of his human peers, which I think is fantastic. This, along with everything else that we've already discussed, really rounds out Vil, and while he is still quite dedicated to the things that are important to him, which kind of limits his sphere of influence and somewhat pigeonholes him, overall, I think he's still very admirable, and I'm so glad they went this route with his character. The more time I've spent with Vil, the more time I've come to respect him. So in the personality department, I'm gonna give him a 9.5. I still don't like him as much as some other characters. However, I can't deny just how well written and nuanced he is. And because he subverted my expectations and is so much better than what I imagined him to be, I gotta give him some extra points. When it comes to his studies, Vil is not slacking at all. From my memory of the story and the vignettes I have, we don't really get to see his academics mentioned very much, so I've always assumed that that means that he can't be doing that bad. However, when it comes to Vil specifically, the fact that he's able to not only lead Pomfiore, but also lead a dance troupe, and during all of that, maintain his grades is just astonishing. I don't think I'd ever survive such pressure, but not only does Vil survive, he does so with grace. And I think that speaks volumes to his tenacity. There are some topics where Vil excels, like in alchemy, and we can see him doing well in these pursuits in various story beats. I also did a little digging like I did with Ruggy to see if I could find anything else about Vil's grades, and in some of the vignettes I don't have, like his Bloom Broom story, Vil remarks that his flight grades are average, but only his flight grades are average, which I guess is fair enough given his reasoning. But the more important point from this vignette that I think justifies just how well Vil is doing academically is that he had no prior magical experience before coming to NRC. The only thing he did have knowledge of was how to craft cosmetics, but everything else that he's accomplished on the magic front, aside from probably his unique magic, because I don't think know exactly when that manifested, has been at NRC. Given how strong Vil is, this is no small feat at all, and I think he's absolutely put in the work. I'm a bit blown away by this fact, honestly, given the everything else about Vil, but also considering that it kind of makes sense. Vil is very dedicated to acting and to his personal pursuits, and if he were to be doing anything poorly at school, the tabloids would pick it up in a second. Plus, I don't think that he would forgive himself for not doing his best, since he's striving to perfect every other aspect of his life. No matter how you spin it, this is just impressive, and for it, Vil is going to get a 10. Now, Vil's card is a Flora, Cosmic, and Eventual Flora defense type card. The first spell at max level will place a modest curse on foes along with a minor power drain, while the third unlockable spell applies a longer lasting modest power drain. This card is built for defense exams and outlasting opponents, as you'll be able to negate most of their damage if using both utility spells. However, to do that, you likely won't be going up against fire enemies, given the Flora elements. The Cosmic spell inclusion does open up doors for use cases, but this card can't go everywhere since it's still otherwise locked in Flora. Even though this is the case, the Curse ability is quite unique and on brand for Vil, and it can be incredibly useful in certain contexts like battle map tiles where enemies heal, or some of those stubborn story battles, and even in some overblot fights. While it's not the greatest defense type card out there, it does have its place, and in that place it does very well. I just can't justify ranking it too high because it is also still limited, so it's going to get a 6.5 here. Meaning, Vil is going to receive 26 total points in this contest. Rook now took all my words away. He gets to use them now, not me, and boy does he use them well. I don't really know where to begin to describe Rook. He's got a lot of little facets that combine to make a dazzling personality, but I guess the most prominent piece of him is his charisma. This guy can talk to anyone about pretty much anything while keeping the conversation genuine. Plus, he has the added grace and social awareness to know how to carefully craft his words to put others at ease. Sure, sometimes this flowery language is more confusing than helpful, but you can just feel the good intentions pouring off of him, so it's a bit hard to be mad in either case. One of the other bits of Rook that becomes very obvious after spending a few minutes near him is that he is ridiculously passionate. Whatever he's interested in, he's invested in 100%, and he'll delightedly tell you all about that thing or person if you ask. He also relentlessly pursues that which he thinks is beautiful, which is as valid as any other kind of devotion, I suppose. But it is ultimately what led him to his current position and his current relationships, and I love that for him. At the end of book 5, we find out from Nej just how dedicated Rook is to him, and I honestly wish I had a fraction of that energy because wow, just wow. But of course, every rose has its thorns, and Rook also has his bad habits too. As in pursuit of beauty, Rook likes to stalk individuals to find out more about them, and is not above crawling through the bushes to get that perfect covert angle. He's also interested in hunting, as his name might suggest, and so he also enjoys covertly crawling through the bushes to gain intel on potential prey or prey species. It's very creepy, but Rook manages to counteract that with his endless wellspring of charisma, and somehow he's still incredibly likable. He's got the heart of a poet, the eyes of an artist, and the determination of a hunter, which rounds him out quite well and gets him an 8 in my book. Now, for studiousness, there is no way you can tell me that Rook Hunt is failing. This guy has the entirety of the school's height, weight, species, dorm, class memorized, and while this may be the result of a fixation, it's still ridiculously impressive. Not only that, but Rook is the vice housewarden of Pomfiore, a position he would not be in if his grades were slipping, because somehow I don't think Vil would ever allow such a thing. Plus, we also get to see a few instances of Rook mentoring his underclassmen in both academics, as seen in Leona's Labor vignette, and manners, as seen in Eppel's ceremonial robes vignette. He has a wide variety of knowledge, and he's very graceful in his teachings as well, regardless of the subject, which all essentially means that Rook is set when it comes to academics. And to add yet another feather into his cap, Rook is also a member of the Science Club, which centers around a subject which can be very difficult to understand and execute. Yet it seems like Rook does extremely well in this pursuit too, when he's not scaring the freshman members at least. But even then, he's still sciencing well, so that's something. Given how well Rook seems to be doing in all of his other pursuits, I'm gonna give him a 9 here. It's a bit unknown if this general knowledge is a result of studying or are just things he's picked up throughout his life. And I don't know how well he'd be doing if he didn't have the extra motivation of being near Vil. So I'm not gonna give him a perfect score, but a 9 is still extremely solid. For his card, Rook has a Flora, Fire, and eventual Water attack type card with decent stats and interesting abilities. At max level on his first spell, he's got the standard power boost to caster, but on his unlockable third spell, he not only has a damage boost, but minor HP regen for 3 turns. I love me an HP regen, and this I think unlocks a bit more utility for the card beyond the elemental spread, which automatically gains this card points because Rook can go anywhere and do pretty much anything once that third spell is unlocked. This is fantastic because you can have a strong attacker and a healer wrapped into one, or you can just blast your opponents with magical damage. The choice is yours, and having that choice is fantastic. The stats are somewhat standard for this type of card, and while it isn't the strongest of the bunch, it can go in pretty much every use case and has enough utility to work in those use cases, so I'm giving it an 8 here. That means that Rook is going home with 25 total points. Next up is Idia Shroud, who at first glance is your typical soft-spoken, socially anxious introvert. However, when he opens his mouth, you get to see a whole new side of him, and as we've spent more time with him in books 6 and 7, I've started to appreciate his character a bit more. Idia is reserved and doesn't like leaving his room, which is further reinforcing his social anxiety. However, in the right circumstances, Idia is well-spoken, although at times a bit blunt. And in these situations, his experiences and knowledge really get to shine. If he's playing a board game or chatting over the internet, he has absolutely no problem voicing his opinions or keeping casual conversation. But as soon as he's confronted by an IRL person without a buffer, he falls apart a bit. There are also a lot of activities that Idia is reluctant to participate in because they involve socialization or are to develop skills he feels like he'll never practically use. So what's the point in that, right? However, regarding activities that he does value, the dude almost cannot be stopped. Idia has a variety of technical talents and is wickedly smart in the STEM department, even having a bunch of little startups and other little projects going on at any given time. With his technical genius comes a great deal of pride and therefore some condescension, which has led to some fantastically unfortunate moments when he starts running his mouth. However, Idia isn't all quiet or all jerk. He's a nice mix of both, and he can also be surprisingly realistic. In fact, Idia seems to be the most generally aware character, since he can call out others for their ridiculous actions and clock absurdities scarily well. He's also the only character who fourth wall breaks and hints at the existence of the game, or the existence of game limitations, within the world. Part of this might be just attributed to his gamer instincts, since he usually incorporates gaming terms into his general speech, so he may just be relating his personal experience to a video game, not to twists specifically, but sometimes it feels like it's a lot more informed than that, and I find it to be a very interesting piece of his character. And honestly, for me, Idia is rather relatable. I too wish that I didn't have to leave my house or teach people how to use certain applications on the daily despite not being employed for tech support. And I also hate physical activities, and my social battery drains ridiculously fast. And when you see pieces of yourself in others, I think you tend to subconsciously like them a bit more. Also, I nearly died of laughter during the Ignihai section of book 7, and that specifically has skyrocketed my opinion of Idia, so this time around I'm giving Idia an 8 for personality. Good job, buddy. When it comes to his studies, everything outside of athletics has to be 10s across the board, so I've got to give him a 10 here. The dude is a self-certified genius, and while STEM talents do not necessarily transfer over to subjects like art and history, I doubt Idia's had any true trouble with them. He seems to have in his information intake down, and I'm also unsure that he'd have gotten so many internships thrown at him if his grades were in the gutter. I suppose, on the other hand, having a stellar research project would be able to kind of counteract any bad grades you might have, since I can't really imagine that your specialized day job in tech would necessarily require you to have memorized a lot of historical dates. But who am I to say such things? Although I really just can't foresee that being an issue, and I think all of the studying that Idia had to do to get to the point where he is at with his technological skills is impressive enough on his own, let alone anything else that he's done at NRC. The only thing potentially holding him back is his PE grades, because the boy is terrified of physical activity. In fact, he's so bad at running and despises it so much that he created a whole gear for Ortho to run for him so he could live up to Vargas's expectations, which completely defeats the point of the exercise. But the fact he was able to do that in such little time with a bit of time watching Jack, I think is way more impressive and noteworthy here. So because Idia gets 10s across the board in pretty much everything else to my knowledge, as far as I'm aware anyways, I didn't do as extensive research on him as I did for Vil and Ruggy and other characters, but despite all of that, I'm still gonna give him a 10 here. From a card perspective though, Idia's dorm uniform is quite unique, and it has an ability that I don't believe any of the other dorm uniform cards has, and this ability is just so fitting for Idia's character. This card is a fire, cosmic, and eventual fire defense type card that at max level has debuff removal for allies and power drain to foes on its first spell, with nullify blind for allies and a power cut to foes on its third spell. The debuff removal will work for any debuff in the game, so if used properly, this can be a game changer during the flow of battle. Of course, an ability this powerful has to be balanced somehow, and so it's coupled with the fire element on the first spell, so you likely won't be using it or this card generically against water enemies, which does limit the use cases for this card and therefore the usefulness of the buff. However, having this card seems like it'd be so good for those pesky story battles where you're constantly getting blinded or burned or what have you, because Idia can just zap away that for one of the characters at the very least. And because of this card is getting an 8. All in all, Idia is ending up with 25 total points. Not so bad. Next is Malleus Draconia, our legendary, extraordinary gargoyle-loving dragon, who's honestly very much a vibe. He's demure, refined, and noble. However, he isn't very mindful, at least in the way that translates well to his peers. Malleus has lived his entire life in the Briar Valley and is considered a national treasure due to the circumstances of his birth. So his interactions with others during his childhood have been limited and formal. At least it seems that way from the information that we have. Because of this, Malleus can be a little awkward at times and doesn't quite understand some of the nuances of the modern human world, which can lead to some confusion. Up until the Firelight Sky event, he'd never ridden in a car. His cell phones are constantly getting reduced to rubble due to him not understanding technology. He's had a bit of difficulty cracking eggs in the culinary crucible, and his dorm uniform vignette clearly demonstrates a lack of fundamental human knowledge. These things aren't expressly his fault, and Malleus, for his part, is trying his darndest to understand this new world. In fact, it's the very reason that Lilia brought him to NRC, and I do think it's doing him good. But despite his faults, Malleus is still very much a big sweetie who's very happy to host, is delighted to be received, and pays back kindness with kindness. Sometimes he gets a little too extravagant with his gifts, but given how ridiculously powerful Malleus is, it does kind of make sense. And while sometimes these gifts are also a little self-serving, they're still very much appreciated. Except that one gift, but we're still working through that. His relationship with those in Diasomnia is positive, and even his interactions with others are generically good and sometimes even playful. In the Firelight Sky event, Jamil is stressed because of Malleus' status. However, no one in the town actually knows who he is, so everyone just approaches him like he's a normal person, and Malleus is delighted. A similar thing happens in Glorious Masquerade, and in both events we get to see Malleus be respectful of these new people while also being curious about their lives, wares, and cultures. I think this curiosity really underscores Malleus too, because everything in the human world is new to him. All the customs, the technology, the food, the people, all of it is new, and he doesn't reject any of it. In fact, he wishes he could experience more of it. However, his near infinite wellspring of power keeps a lot of folks from approaching him, which unfortunately limits his learning. In any case, though, Malleus is a wonderful character whose actions are consistent if nothing else. It's really just the tone of these actions that change depending on how familiar he is with someone. And just because he's formal doesn't mean he also isn't cheeky at times. We see in his PE uniform vignette that he gets a little salty at Cater, calling him essentially unapproachable, before Cater asks for a favor. So Malleus obliges in order to be polite, but then purposely messes up each and every picture to get his point across. While this is hilariously petty, it also feels a bit like a boundary definition, and it is done in a way that's rather graceful overall, which I think combined with everything else sums up Malleus nicely. He's a complex character with a lot of facets and a certain kind of innocence that makes him stand out from the rest of NRC, so I can't help but give him a 9 here. For studiousness, though, I have to treat Malleus in the same way as Ortho because Malleus has been tutored in magic by the best of the best for decades. NRC has nothing it can really teach him on the magic front, so he likely doesn't have to study at all to ace anything that would have to do with magic, or history, or athletics. Therefore, I need to rank his social studiousness instead, since the bulk of what Malleus is here to do is to make friends and learn about other species, and he's kinda tried, but he's not done particularly well. Part of this is because of his overwhelming power, as it intimidates all of those around him into not approaching him, and when he approaches others, it's often looked at as a life or death situation, even though it is very much not that, as we can see in Malleus's Labware vignette. However, Malleus doesn't really make an effort to engage with others either, unless he needs something from them, at least from what we can see. I think this is in part him knowing about all the rumors swirling around school and perhaps not wanting to make others uncomfortable, and partially because his own experiences are so different from those around him, it can be hard to relate. The poor boy unintentionally ruffles feathers and doesn't have the experience to understand why what he did made folks upset, like we can see in his dorm uniform vignette, and at the beginning of Book 7. And while I have faith that he'll get there eventually, right now he's struggling a bit. I feel like this sort of study is something that he really wants to do, as he is rather curious and does want to make friends, and in the long run, I think it would benefit him greatly. But up until Book 7 and even during it, at least up to the current point of its release in EN, he doesn't seem to have learned all that much in this department. So unfortunately for Malleus, I'm going to rank him out of 5 because he has made some effort, but he's got a long, long way to go. On the card front though, Malleus has to get a high score because this fully cosmic powerhouse attack type card with critical chance is just so fun. The card's abilities on the first and third spell at max level are critical chance to oneself or allies respectively, which means this card or your other party members have a chance to dish out even more damage than normal. If you're able to get this boost onto one of your other cards that also has elemental advantage, you can raise your enemies. Of course, to balance this card itself, its elements are cosmic, and one more cosmic, since this elemental type doesn't have any advantages or disadvantages. This means Malleus will be doing consistent damage in every battle without any extras besides his crit chance. But hey, consistent damage is consistent damage, and when the crits work, they work great. Given that this card is an attacker and attacks well, I'm going to give it an 8, again because it feels so useful, but also because it feels like you might have to babysit it a little bit, depending on the course of the battle that you're in and which of the buffs you've chosen to take. So these sorts of situational changes can somewhat affect the card's performance, which has tanked the score a little bit. However, on the whole, it's extremely decent, so it's still getting the 8. And with that, Malleus is receiving 22 total points. Last but not least is Lilia Vanrouge, the best Peepaw at NRC. And if that was our contest, then Lilia would win. But this is the best junior competition, so let's chat about that personality. Lilia, on the whole, is a rather easygoing individual who is more focused on living his own life than fretting about others. However, that is not to say he doesn't care about anyone at all. In fact, Lilia is a rather dedicated mentor figure to pretty much all of Diasomnia, making him the father friend of the group, and to a few individuals in the dorm, he's an actual father figure. Despite his prankster tendencies and easygoing nature, Lilia is much older than he appears, and with that age comes a ton of experience that he uses in those contexts to mentor his peers and adopted kiddos. In fact, it's likely because of Lilia's extensive travels and experience that he gets along so well with so many people, and why he may not be as concerned about some of the pettier problems of his peers. Lilia is also ridiculously dedicated to his charges, and he does take care of them extremely well. However, he knows better than to be overbearing, since some lessons can only ever be taught by life, so he does his best to strike a balance there. And while on the whole he's relaxed, there are times where the strict general of the past comes out, like during the Leona confrontation at the end of Book 2 and his rebuke of Sebek in the beginning of Book 7. He even gets a casual dig in at Azul and Co. at the beginning of Book 7 too, as the trio were directly involved in the events of Book 2, which up until this point in the story, I don't think anyone in Diasomnia addressed directly with Octavanel, but it is a clear example of Lilia setting up boundaries and expectations with his peers that even though he isn't holding too much of a grudge, they aren't getting away without any consequence. But at the end of the day, peace is the greater goal. To this end, Lilia is also very mature, which is also, again, probably due to his life experiences, but this can often catch his peers by surprise since Lilia, by all accounts, really doesn't act or seem old. But his nuggets of wisdom are golden, and while he isn't infallible, he's still a very solid guy, so he's going to get a solid 10 here. I find him to be such a fun dude that has so much more depth than you'd ever expect by appearances alone, and I personally enjoy that complexity enough to give him full marks here. From a studying perspective, Lilia doesn't really have to study. At least, I don't think that he does, and I don't really remember any instance of his grades being discussed, so I don't really know how to rank him here. Lilia has lived through a lot and has been to so many different places and has had so much experience that it's hard to imagine him doing poorly in any of the school subjects. He's also not only Fae, but a battle-hardened Fae, so any magic-based lessons are going to be a breeze too. Much like Malleus, Lilia is also likely at the school to seek out new social experiences while also keeping an eye on Malleus. And while that doesn't guarantee he'd be doing well academically, I feel like he'd have to intentionally fail for his grades to be low. However, he also doesn't have the best memory and can be seen talking about how forgetful he is every once in a while, which I suppose could be a problem. But even still, I doubt it's affecting this area of his life too much. So because of this, I'm a little bit lost. It's not as cut and dry of a case like Ortho or Malleus where I can just rate how well they're doing at becoming more relatable to their peers, because Lilia already does that. Rating his cooking skills would be out of pocket and unfair, and rating his mentorship or the lessons he teaches would net him a 10 anyway, right? Or would it? Lilia does a fairly good job at guiding the rest of the Diasomnia boys, and he encourages them to learn on their own while also stepping in to correct them when they are wrong. There is a delicate balance in the approach that Lilia takes to encounter these youths, as he doesn't wish to stifle them, yet he also cannot in good faith let them fall too far from grace. In this, though, I think Lilia can sometimes be a bit too lenient with the boys will be boys attitude, and for that I'm going to knock off a few points from his score. I'm not sure that the Book 7 Rebuke of Sebek was the only one Lilia ever gave him. However, it is the only one that we get to witness, and for the rest of the story, up until this point, Sebek's bad habits are kind of ignored by those around him, including Lilia. With this in mind, I'll be giving Lilia an 8 here. He's very good at what he does, but he's not perfect, so that's where he'll rank. From a card perspective, Lilia's got a Flora Cosmic Defense type card with an eventual unlockable Flora spell. The stats are quite good, and so is the utility, so at first glance, the card appears solid. The first spell has Power Drain on foes for 1 turn, and the third spell has both Curse and Nullify Blind for 2 and 1 turn respectively. The abilities of that unlockable spell are really nice, so of course they're locked behind the uncaps, but with them, this card can be a good ally in battle. Unfortunately, having 2 of the same element does lock this card into certain use cases, so it's not perfect, but it's decent enough to get itself an 8 in my book. Which means that Lilia is getting a very snazzy 26 for his total points. That also means that we now have all of our points for all of our boys, so we can now see who is the best of the junior class. In 8th place with 18.5 cumulative points, we have Leona. In 7th place with 20 points is Cater. In 6th, we have Trey with 21 points. In 5th is Malleus with 22 points. In 4th, we've got Rook with 25 points. And yet again, we have a 3-way tie for first with Idia, Vil, and Lilia. At this point, I think I should just marry the wheel because I'm clearly incapable of making decisions. But the wheel will not be our final deciding factor. Instead, we shall turn our gaze to rock, paper, scissors. Each boy has been randomly assigned their choice, so all that's left now is to see how the chips fall. Ready, set, go. Oh, Scissors took an aggressive start, getting rid of all the paper, but that's not going to work out very well for them. That means that in 3rd place, we have Idia. In 2nd place, we have Vil. But in 1st place, we have Lilia Vanrouge, the best of the junior class. Well done, Lilia. Now, I must ask if you think the Hand of Fate was kind with this determination, or do you think that someone else is better suited to win this spot? Let me know down below, and while you're there, please do tell me if you liked the video and want more content like it. If comments aren't your thing, you could also like this video or maybe even subscribe. But regardless, I just gotta let you know that you're amazing, and I hope you have a wonderful day.